Crimea is a sacred place for every Vatnik and Z patriot. Crimea may not be a sandwich, but it has replaced the sandwich for them. They are willing to go hungry as long as the cherished peninsula remains part of their wannabe empire.
I'll go hungry too, for Putin. I stood and I will keep standing.
Crimea is the main asset of Putin's regime. It's the sweet, tempting carrot dangled on a string in front of the herd of obedient serfs, so they mindlessly follow the pale leader into his strange alternative reality. Every true Putinist and patriot of the Russian Reich is convinced that Khrushchev illegally gifted Crimea to Ukraine and that Mordor had every right to annex it because Crimea is primordially Russian territory.
On February 19, 1954, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, under pressure from Khrushchev, issued a decree on the transfer of the Crimean region from the RSFSR to the Ukrainian SSR. As stated in the document, this decision was made taking into account the commonality of the economy, territorial proximity, and close economic and cultural ties between the Crimean region and the Ukrainian SSR. However, this wording does not reflect the true reasons for the change in the peninsula's status at all.
The claim that Crimea has always been Russian is just as absurd as saying that Lenin invented Ukraine.
Well, all right, everything quieted down and no one remembers it the way people remember Crimea today. Wonderful. But we also try not to remember how Ukraine actually came together. Who created it anyway? Vladimir Ilyich Lenin.
Crimea has only been connected to Russia for just over 100 years of disgrace, and that's out of a 3,000-year history. Let's answer the main question that distinguishes a human from an orc. Whose is Crimea?
So, Crimea has returned to root. Is that why, yes, you are marching here? Tell me, why do you personally think this is good or bad? I do not know. Why do you think it is good?
Well, Russia is the best country in the world. That's why the world is always for Russia. That's just how it is sometimes.
I see. Do you know anything about Crimea?
Well, actually, no.
From the 12th to the 6th century BC, the Cimmerians, Scythians, and Tauri lived in Crimea. We haven't heard of Scythians playing the balalaika or eating pancakes off a shovel. All of them were Iranian-speaking peoples. So it turns out that Crimea is historically Iranian land. So it's not surprising that Iran still does not recognize Crimea as Russian, even though it is an ally of Muscovy.
Iran promises to continue supplying Iranian drones and missiles to the Russian Federation for use in the war against Ukraine. This is reported by The Times. Despite all this, Iran has refused to recognize Crimea and other Ukrainian territories as part of Russia. So it turns out the agreement was made on Iran's terms. In other words, Russia was forced to sign the agreement, and it's unlikely that Masoud Barzani will be sending Iranian soldiers to fight in the war against Ukraine.
Maybe Crimea became Russian after the Scythians? Of course not. In the 7th century BC, Greek colonists replaced the Scythians. They built the city-states of Chersonesus, Feodosia, Panticapaeum, and hundreds of other settlements. Basically, the Crimea as we know it was created by the Hellenes. So it turns out Crimea has always been Greek.
This is Sparta, you know?
And the Russians, on the contrary, are destroying what civilized people built. During the occupation of the peninsula, the orcs turned the historical Greek heritage into some kind of disgusting shopping mall on the outskirts of Chelyabinsk. At the entrance to Chersonesus, there are now Greek letters displayed, written in Cyrillic, but they make absolutely no sense in Greek.
What is this word? I mean, what exactly does this word mean?
Vulgarity elevated to the absolute. Socrates is turning over in his grave. The Russian world destroys not only the present and the future, but also the past.
That same evening, unidentified people in camouflage seized the Ukr-Telecom building and cut all the wires, took over the Crimean television and radio company, and that's far from the whole list. Armed to the teeth, people are bravely standing near all Ukrainian military bases, units, and facilities, saying they've come to protect our soldiers.
Maybe after the Greeks, the Russians appeared in Crimea. Again, no. In 63 BC, Crimea was conquered by the Roman Empire, the very same Western world. Crimea joined NATO long before the inhabitants of Russia learned to walk on two legs. The Romans ruled Crimea for about 400 years. Just so you understand, Russia only possessed the peninsula for 170 years. So historically, Crimea is Italian. Considering that Celentano's ancestors also owned part of Crimea during the Renaissance in the 14th and 15th centuries. The Genoese built a fortress in the city of Sudak and ruled there for 205 years. So in total, Crimea was Italian for 600 years.
Honestly, it's really not your fault.
During the Italian period, culture, trade, and winemaking flourished on the peninsula. Meanwhile, in Muscovy, people were developing the art of impalement and playing spoons until they passed out.
Volkov was under our rule, but their access to the sea.
After the Romans, the Goths came to Crimea. And the Goths are Germans. So that means this is originally German territory. And according to Russian logic, that would mean Hitler was right when he came to take it back. After that, Crimea once again passed to the Greeks from Byzantium, and then it was seized by the people of Kiev. Grand Prince Sviatoslav Igorevich stormed into the peninsula with full force, and Vladimir Sviatoslavich solidified the influence of the people of Pechersk over Crimea.
By law, by conscience, and by history, Crimea, of course, belongs to Ukraine. The president slyly keeps quiet about the fact that Prince Vladimir was the Prince of Kiev. And he baptized first and foremost Kievan Rus, because compared to Kiev, Moscow, which was first mentioned in 1147, is not even a great-granddaughter, but a great-great-granddaughter of Kiev.
Kiev ruled Crimea for about 200 years. That's already longer than Moscow. After that, Crimea was ruled by the Golden Horde, and it was originally Mongolian. Then the Golden Horde collapsed, as all empires do, and Crimea became Tatar. And only at the end of the 18th century was Tavrida temporarily occupied by Russia. And all this time, the pseudo-empire was carrying out genocide against the local peoples who had actually lived there for centuries.
At dawn on May 18th, 1944, NKVD officers broke into the homes of Crimean Tatars all across Crimea, accused them of treason and collaboration with the Nazis, and forcibly deported them to the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia. The deportees were given anywhere from a few minutes to half an hour to pack their things.
At the beginning of the 20th century, Kiev again became the capital of Crimea. In 1917, the peninsula became part of the Ukrainian People's Republic. On October 12, 1917, the Black Sea Fleet raised Ukrainian flags. And since 1954, Crimea became Ukrainian forever, and this saved the peninsula from extinction and devastation. Up until 1954, under Russian administration, Crimea was brought to a catastrophic state. It was the most depressed region. After the deportation of the Tatars, Bulgarians, Armenians, and Greeks, the deserted lands were populated by Laptenogik. But the Stalinist colonizers from the northern backwaters were unable to manage agriculture in the southern region. Area of crops in Crimea decreased by 70,000 hectares compared to 1940. Only 41,000 hectares of land were irrigated. In Moscow, more area is irrigated for elevators in a year than the Russians managed in Crimea. And 3,000 years ago, the Greeks did this with ease. By 1954, out of 30 collective farms, only 3 were able to sow the fields and harvest any crops at all. The peninsula was literally dying out. Even 10 years after the end of World War II, Crimea lay in ruins. No one was restoring it.
Out of 6,000 pre-war buildings in Sevastopol, only 7 were more or less preserved. These were the Pokrovsky Cathedral, the Krashitsky Museum.
Take a look at the occupied Donbas, and it becomes clear why Crimea was deteriorating.
I will explain to you right now what this is lying here. These aren't just little bags. It's being reported that at 1 Lyashenko Street, people are throwing bags of feces out the window in the first entrance.
The newly arrived Crimeans, those who back in 2014 all wanted to return to their native harbor, had no idea in their hearts what to do or how to survive in an unfamiliar land. It turned out that most of the newcomers were seeing grapes and corn for the first time in their lives. All they had seen before were wolves, wolf dens, and wolfberries.
What is the name of this country, please?
Russia, the country!
Crimea needed to be urgently saved, and only Ukrainians could do it. That's why, in 1954, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR unanimously approved the decision to transfer Crimea to Ukraine. It wasn't Khrushchev drunk, as the Z supporters loved to shout, but the entire Soviet leadership unanimously.
I think there will be no objections. When Khrushchev asked his question, Bulganin, Mikoyan, Kirichenko, Kaganovich, and others responded with exclamations, "It's right to accept, to transfer."
The official reason for the transfer was shared economy, territorial proximity, and cultural ties. In other words, even the Soviets admitted Crimea was closer to Ukraine than to Russia.
That's a strong statement.
And as soon as Crimea became part of Ukraine, the situation immediately began to improve dramatically. It was the Ukrainians who turned the peninsula into what Russians call the Russian Pearl.
In February 1957, the City Party Committee reported the completion of Sevastopol's restoration. 700,000 square meters of housing were built in the city, more than before the war.
Ukraine literally raised the peninsula from ruins. The North Crimean Canal from the Dnipro was built, and it was completed already in independent Ukraine. Kyiv developed agriculture and created resort infrastructure. Ukrainians built housing, roads, hospitals, schools, ports, hotels, theaters, bus stations, and boarding houses in Crimea, and also restored architectural monuments. And most importantly, the Russians who moved in were allowed to feel at home in Crimea, to speak their own language, watch Kiselyov, and even keep their military fleet there. And for this, the Russians repaid them with treacherous aggression.
I absolutely really don't want to leave Crimea and Sakalut.
It's so great here.
The annexation of Crimea was Moscow's fatal mistake. It was with the seizure of Crimea that the real collapse of the pseudo-empire began. The annexation of Crimea dragged Russia into a war it cannot win. And the very fact of seizing someone else's territory under the slogan of so-called self-determination of the Crimean people gave impetus to national liberation movements within Russia itself. On top of that, since 2014, the Russian Federation has had no internationally recognized borders. And if there are no borders, there is no state. Russians really love primitive symbols. Vodka, balalaika, a mummy in the city center.
That's it, they only left the brushwood.
It's astonishing, but even the last drunk lying in a puddle by the fence confidently takes pride in the ballet, the Nutcracker, as if he has anything to do with it. But above all, Russians adore phallic symbols. The Sarmat missile, the Ostenkino Tower, and of course, the Crimean Bridge, whose size is obviously meant to compensate for the small geostrategic appendage of the pale dictator.
Russia is truly capable of successfully executing such remarkable world-class infrastructure projects. After all, it's not just the largest bridge in Russia, but by length, it's the largest bridge in Europe.
The Crimean Bridge has become Russia's main pride over the past 10 years. It's a kind of colossus of roads on top of the Tower of Babel, riding the Pyramid of Cheops. The whole world was supposed to be amazed and become bipolar.
They fooled us. They just blatantly deceived us.
They wrote hymns about the Crimean Bridge, named children after it, and made ridiculous movies about it.
Welcome
to the Crimean Bridge, the biggest bridge in Russia.
By the way, during the filming of that sorry excuse for a movie, the Bobrov family embezzled hundreds of millions of rubles. The movie about the bridge ended up almost as expensive as the bridge itself.
Alexei Gromov personally writes to the Ministry of Culture demanding Simonian be given 100 million rubles without any competitions or selections and as a non-repayable, non-refundable grant.
The Crimean Bridge became Putin's personal construction project. In fact, it's not even a bridge, but handcuffs that have chained the occupied peninsula to Mordor.
The ceremony was attended by the country's president, Vladimir Putin. He drove a Kamaz truck across the bridge. The Crimean Bridge was opened by the bridge builders.
But in the end, the Crimean Bridge became not an achievement, but truly a curse for Russia. A real pain and a Damocles' sword, on which the very existence of the entire state depends. Without the sacredness and symbolism that Kremlin propaganda has pumped into the Crimean Bridge, its destruction would be a massive psychological blow and a point of no return for Muscovy. Now, in the eyes of the majority of the population of the Russian Reich, the fall of the bridge means the fall of the entire empire, and is seen as a personal defeat and catastrophe for Putin.
The feeling is just, I don't know, I'm getting goosebumps right now. But we haven't even gotten onto the bridge yet, we're just approaching it. This is absolutely so awesome!
Majestically, the sun shines above you, even though this plan is quite tricky and not simple at all. We're building a huge bridge on the planet. The longest Russian bridge, the Crimean Bridge.
Oh, you Crimean Bridge! You're really not that simple!
Naturally, Ukraine will certainly do everything possible without hesitation to cut this Russian appendix off from its territory.
Will the Crimean Bridge burn down this year? Well, I hope so. It really does need to come to an end. Absolutely.
Connecting Crimea with Taman is not Putin's invention. One of the first to come up with this idea was his spiritual mentor, Adolf Hitler. During the occupation, the Nazis really did try to build a bridge across the Kerch Strait in 1942, and the goal was the same as Putin's, to provide convenient logistics for their invading troops, and to turn Crimea into a military base and a staging ground, because sea transport was vulnerable to attacks from the Soviet fleet and air force, just as now the Ork's sea transport is vulnerable to Ukrainian drones.
Damn it. Seriously now.
It's obvious that Putin was inspired by the Third Reich's plans and literally adopted them. The Nazis viewed Crimea as an important strategic point for further operations in the region. In exactly the same way, after building the bridge, Putin used it for further invasion of Ukraine.
A coincidence? I don't think so.
The Nazi project envisioned the construction of a railway and automobile bridge based on the design of the Soviet bridge, which the Soviets didn't have time to finish in 1941 because they were retreating. The Germans also didn't manage to finish building the bridge because they were retreating in 1943. And in general, the whole idea turned out to be very expensive, so the Third Reich abandoned it. It was only in 1944 that the USSR finally built a temporary railway bridge on the unfinished German remnants, but it was literally washed away by ice. Since then, it was decided not to mess around with bridges in the Kerch Strait anymore and to make do with ferries. Later, Crimea became part of Ukraine, and the issue basically became irrelevant because all supplies came from Ukraine. But in the 21st century, a new Nazi state appeared in the world, and Russia, in the best traditions of Adolf Aloisovich, nevertheless erected this marvel of fascist architecture.
From now on, figuratively speaking, Crimea is no longer an island. Crimea is now forever connected to the mainland part of our vast country by the solid ground of the bridge.
The euphoria quickly faded, because it turned out that Putin had built the largest target in human history. In fact, you could call the Crimean Bridge the Crimean shooting range. With the start of the full-scale invasion, the Crimean Bridge began, to put it mildly, to take a beating from behind, from the front, from above, from the side, and from below. On October 8, 2022, Ukrainian intelligence carried out an elegant operation called A Package from Your Boy. A truck exploded on the Crimean Bridge, which had been traveling from the Krasnodar region. It blew up at precisely the moment when a train carrying fuel was passing by on the bridge.
Just look, the Crimean Bridge is on fire. It just went off literally only about 2 minutes ago. Right now, actually. Exactly 6 seconds, exactly.
Hey there, friend.
I saw something here. Yeah, they blew up the bridge, yeah.
The bridge was definitely not left intact. Several spans collapsed and traffic across it was shut down. On July 17, 2023, Putin's cuticle was attacked by Ukrainian surface drones, which blew up part of the roadbed.
When we hit the target successfully, it was a real explosion of emotions. All men are a bit like children. Everyone started jumping around, just like kids, honestly.
As a result, the Kremlin frantically began building massive defenses around the bridge. They brought in air defense systems from all over the country, as well as warships and naval barriers. The strait was blocked with barges, rusty ships, and buoys. So much anti-aircraft equipment was brought in that the entire European part of Russia was left exposed and defenseless against Ukrainian drones. Moscow is spending enormous resources, human, technical, and financial, to protect the bridge. But even so, it keeps getting hit, and sooner or later, it will be destroyed anyway.
There will be many surprises, both at sea and in the sky, regarding Crimea and regarding other temporarily occupied territories.
These drones are modified jet skis that the Ukrainian armed forces have learned to convert into kamikaze drones. Presumably one of them is shown in the video footage. According to some reports, such drones can carry up to half a ton of explosives. At the moment of the terrorist attack over the Black Sea, an American MQ-9 Reaper reconnaissance and strike UAV was flying in the area. In fact, no one is even trying to hide anything.
The Crimean Bridge is the crystal vase of the Putin regime. Fragile, expensive showmanship, like a Fabergé egg. Only this Putin's egg has no cultural value. It has only legal value as one of the pieces of evidence of his crimes. Subtitles by DMAT. Everyone has already forgotten how Putin pompously opened the bridge in person. Now, this structure is constantly being closed due to the threat of bombings and is firmly associated with something temporary and dangerous. The mood among the occupiers in Crimea itself is also very gloomy. More and more of the visiting Lapton-footed animals are getting back on their skis and returning to their native swamp haven. Those who moved to Crimea after 2014 are now literally sitting on their suitcases, praying that the bridge will hold out until the moment they urgently need to escape. None of them have any doubt anymore that Crimea will be deoccupied.
I really don't want to leave Crimea or Alushta. It's so great here.
You've gotten used to it, right?
I've gotten used to it. We lived here like it was our own home. Everything felt so warm and homely.
According to experts, half of the newcomers will flee even before deoccupation begins. Which is logical, because by the time the Ukrainian defense forces enter, the Crimean Bridge is unlikely to still be intact.
It's terrible what happened, of course. Terrible events happened. I don't know how to get out now. It's a pity about the bridge. Everything is bad. It's a pity about the bridge. And now it's a problem figuring out how to leave.
Lately, residents of Crimea have been actively buying up real estate in the Krasnodar region. What could that mean?
It's unclear, really.
The Russian world is preparing for a great resettlement of vatniks back to lands rich in hawthorn and domestic violence. And they don't have much time left before the Kerch Bridge turns into the Kerch Coral Reef.
I would like to remind you that this video is created for entertainment purposes and contains elements of satire and irony. All facts and events are presented in a hyperbolized or exaggerated form to convey a comedic or dramatic effect. Our goal is not to mislead, but to highlight humor. Please take it with a smile.